Thanks everyone for coming. It's always a problem when your competition had an hour to give an advertisement beforehand, so I'm glad to see a good number of people here this afternoon. Yeah, look, I'm going to take you through, I guess, a lot of the information that we've been pulling together and as the team in the grains team in the Wimmera about soil health and about, I guess, how your farming systems work and where the benefits are, both, I guess, in a business sense, but also for the environment. And you'll see a string of logos across there. You know, the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority and DSE are investors in the sort of work that we do, and there's all sorts of other people who we team up with because in the main, all of this has got to be a team effort. Although I do note that some of my colleagues have chosen to watch the competition. So yes, there's a bit of a team there. Some of our own staff, some CMA staff. I've also been fortunate enough to have organisations like the Victorian EPA loan me some equipment and also team up with other departments just as a collaboration, sharing information so that we can sort of go ahead a bit faster. So that's all been really good. Lots of words on this, but pretty much what we do is gather information about risk, use that information to communicate to landholders and more broadly about practice change, why you do it, respecting the fact that farmers run a complicated system, and me, never been cropping, never made a cent from cropping. I'm not here to tell anyone how to run their business, but I would like to give you good information that you might consider in how it might work in your system, whether it's right for you. And so I guess that's the sort of type of advice I'd like to put out there. And some of the work we do, we actually measure how our soils are managed around the landscape, particularly the northern Wimmera. And I guess what we're doing is we're looking at how practices are, particularly conservation farming, stubble retention practices are being used in the landscape, but also we're measuring that change over time. And I'll cover a bit about how we do that. And to a certain extent, that reflects back on how effective we are in doing the practice change in the first place. We can measure how well we're tracking, whether the messages we're putting out there mean anything to you and the farming community. So, some of the things, you know, we've had 9-10 years of pretty dry conditions, thinner stubbles, we've had a lot of dust. I mean, particularly, say, what was it, September 2009, I think was one of the worst. But in my perspective, we did a lot of work, there's a lot of emphasis on wind erosion, which is all about standing stubble. And so when we got to some wetter summers, last year in particular, but the year before as well, we really started seeing some issues. And by measuring the landscape with some cheesy pictures, us driving around the landscape, using spatial data collection, we've got a really good data set now across the Wimmera, which we can use to sort of predict how the rest of the soils are being managed. And our soils are quite variable across the landscape, and it's important for us to understand how management risk, whether there's standing stubble or not, is placed over the different soil risks. So this sort of information allows us to do things like looking at combined stubble retention rates across the northern Wimmera. You can see there's a general trend that's increasing, although if you were being pretty hard-nosed about it, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, you'd say it's sort of flatlined a bit. I think what we've seen, and in particular in 2009, that was kind of our high score. But it was a dry season. We had some good biomass there, but it was the best option for us. There was lots of people were, you know, not wanting to lose those soils. And then we had 2010, which came with some real problems. In terms of the summer and how workable those standing stubbles were in the following sowing. And 2011 created the same issue. So I think the trend from 04 to 09 was pretty much where we're going. That's our intent. And I think we've had our arms twisted a little bit in the last 2 years because of those wet summers. Some of the other information we do pick up about the landscape, and all of this background, I guess, puts you into a perspective about the northern Wimmera, particularly if you're not from the area. We got in conversation with DSE, who ultimately fund some of what we do, and they've got this idea of a sort of a gold standard of controlled traffic no-till as being the silver bullet for all forms of erosion. It's going to protect it all. This is the way forward. And asked me and our team, could we give them some sort of measurement across the landscape of how much controlled traffic no-till there is? And they really wanted a north-south kind of line. If you think about how you would manage that, how I would manage that, being out in the field trying to work out which paddocks are under controlled traffic no-till, I could tell them guidance. Because you look for this time of year with the crop row next to the standing stubbles from last year, eyeball that, that's beautiful. Problem is, if you're on a north-south road, and we've got Geodetic Road, we've got Blue Ribbon Road, they run dead north-south. A lot of our guys are cropping north-south, so they're all parallel to the road. And eventually I decided, well, went back to the DSE and said, well, I can do this, but I'm going to do these on these diagonal roads, the Barung Highway, Dimboola to Warwick Nabil, and then off to Birchip, because then I can eyeball the north-south and the east-west rows, and we can work that out. But I'm not going to be there at the times you're sowing, at the times you're spraying, at the times you're harvesting to see if all your wheels are in the same places. So they're not going to get that. And we did talk about even using satellite imaging to say, well, if you were using controlled traffic even on the turning, then you get this nice geometry. And a satellite can see a 9 metre wide turn and could count those up and see if they're really uniform. But a lot of people manually turn, which brings me unstuck there. So can't get too smart for my own good there. So I've mentioned wet soils over summer, warm wet conditions. One of the advantages of stubble retention is that you're building up your soil health. And in my book, a healthy soil is something that's going to degrade your stubbles, recycle those nutrients, make them available for the following crop. And so after years of this sort of practice, hopefully you've got a thriving soil that, given good conditions of moisture and warmth, you get that. So you've got stubble lying all over the joint, not very easy to sow through. To me, there's a few tweaks we could make to a system like that, and if you actually look in the top right of that picture, you can see some really nice straight stubble standing up there. And so we'll discuss why it's different. It's the same paddock, it was just harvested at different heights. But what this led to, and this was from 2010, around sowing time, is that a lot of people who, hand on heart, wanted to keep their stubble standing, couldn't get through this stuff with their equipment. And so a lot of that happened. And so that's not ideal. There's lots of nutrients in that. There's lots of other trade-offs in doing this. And in fact, if you look at the work of someone like Clive Kirkby from CSIRO, he shows that, in fact, stubble retention systems become more workable in terms of the amount of engine power you need to pull your implements through the soil, just through stubble retention alone. So there are all sorts of costs to do with burning the stubble, let alone the nutrient losses. Now, onto that other strip. What happened in this paddock was the contractor, when every second pass was either 220 mil high or 400 mil high. But the roots are just as rotten in either pass. So what's really gone on here is probably simply that there's more weight pulling them over in that taller stubble. And when you compare them side by side, what you see is, and if you look closely here, these are thatching through the adjacent rows. So on a 330 mil row space, you end up with 400 mil stubble really thatching through, and that probably caused that fouling of the seeder to be more of a problem. And this particular farmer uses a disc seeder. He's worked very hard on working it for his environment. He's in a slightly higher rainfall, sort of closer to the sort of southern Wimmera environment. But heat did persist, but he ended up with great wads of stuff about every 6 or 8 passes, which he ended up burning later just to remove those lumps out of his system. So this year his intent was to, well, late last year his intent was to harvest at about 300 mil high. He didn't want to put all of that biomass through his header, didn't want to go slowly, and he didn't want to have all of that, that stubble, that trash, in contact with the ground, worried about nutrient tie-up. I suspect he's got less to worry about in the sense that that soil's actually in prime condition to sort of start breaking that down pretty quickly. If he's always keeping a lot of stuff in the system, then we should see that as almost as a slow-release fertiliser. As long as you keep topping it up as the supply, then the decomposition should be passing it back into the crop. But you can also see that the stubble throw, the trash throw isn't that great in his system, and that's something he's working on. Because again, if you're worried about tie-up, if you're worried about some of the establishment issues that Phil Needham was talking about, then you probably want to be